Hello there. Good to be with you all. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you over the last few days at your conference, but I've been following avidly on Twitter. So all the people who need to tweet now and then turn off your phones. Let the world know we're talking about something that actually matters to everybody and not just a few. It's a conversation that I'm excited to be contributing to because I think it's of national importance, actually, probably international importance, for a number of reasons. I think one of the things that we have come to forget in modern life is that community is absolutely irreplaceable and essential when it comes to making meaning at times that are painful and don't make any sense, and at times that don't lend themselves to scientific solutions. And death seems to me to be at the forefront of those kinds of experiences. I was thinking, you know, today allegedly is Black Friday, and there's all kinds of good deals to be had. So the notion of trying to defend the idea that we should be returning death back to the community on Black Friday seems to tickle my sense of humor anyway. But I think we do live in a world where true beauty is confused regularly with glamour, and death is regularly confused with failure. And often what is truly good and authentic is confused with what's provable and efficient. And really today I want to put to you that a good death, I think, is a real measure of a good society. And the idea that a good death can be husbanded or midwifed into reality by systems unilaterally doing stuff to people just makes no sense at all to me. So I want to talk about the idea of death and dying and living well from the perspective of the community up rather than the clinical world down. But I also want to talk a little bit about what happens in the middle and really begin to explore not this kind of polemic that says community good, institutions bad, but try to explore how do we get in right relationship so we get the best of the clinical world, the best of the palliative world, and the best of the non-institutional space that I'm loosely calling community. And that's what I'd like to explore over the next 40 minutes. My hope is that what I'll say to you is not new. I don't think we're going to learn anything new here today. But my sense is that an awful lot of this conversation is a conversation about remembering some core fundamental facts about what it means to be human and how we can get better at being human together. The other thing that I hope to do today is speak to the hospice movement and what it means to be at the forefront of a social movement. What is a social movement? And how can we ensure not alone that the authenticity of your movement continues at pace, but also I'd like to look, maybe read some tea leaves, and look to what might be some possible new frontiers for your social movement by looking to other social movements. I was reflecting this morning coming over on the plane from Ireland, from Dublin, that this won't be a new comment to you, but that life is a terminal condition. We're all going to die. And from the Stoics to the Zen Buddhists, we're reminded that death is certain, when is uncertain, and the question is, what should we do? This is a question that not everybody wants to ask, but is pertinent to absolutely every human being. And so it's an honor to be having a conversation of such incredible importance in my mind. Can you see that? It's nice and big, isn't it? This is interesting in my mind because what this says to us is that if we're going to make change happen in the world, then what we need to do is less of doing to people and for people. So moving away from the old medical model, the allopathic approach, if you want to use a technical term, and even moving away from the charity models of rescuing people or doing things to people or seeing people as passive and needing to be fixed, needing to be done for. And instead what we need to do is we need to move into a space which is about being alongside people and doing with. You're all familiar with this narrative. This is the current thinking. So in a way, I think what we're being told, and there's nothing wrong with this at all, but what we're being told is that there's a shift in how we do caring, how we do helping, how we do change. And that shift is away from doing to, doing for, into the doing with space. And I think that's probably partially true. But there's a piece that's missing. And the piece that's missing is what's done by people. You think about it in practical terms and in your own lived experience. When you look at what is actually done by people to have a good day or to have a good life, and indeed to die peacefully, it's quite a lot. I was trying to imagine what it must have been like 50-odd years ago to conceive these wonderful words. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. Powerful words, a powerful call to action for a social movement that's as relevant and as poignant perhaps today as it was when they were first uttered. So how well are we doing? Well, my sense is actually that's not the question, unless you're just looking at this idea that the hospice movement is going to unilaterally produce the solutions that will enable us to have peaceful deaths and live well near the end of life. But I think there's a whole other possibility out there called community that doesn't exist in a palliative world or even in the palliative mindset, and certainly doesn't exist in the clinical world. And I think the dilemma is they're waiting to be asked in. They're waiting to be invited. I mean, I suspect an awful lot of people think the dilemma when it comes to community is either getting them to volunteer, getting them to fundraise, or getting them to talk about death. What are we going to do about the community problem? They're the three categories that we're trying to figure out. Well, I think there's a fourth category and a very essential, foundational category, and that is, how do we show up in the lives of communities with the belief that they have an irreplaceable contribution to make to our movement? And unless we learn not alone to be hosts of the conversation around end of life, but be guests in their lives, they're not going to come to the party. And while it's often very noble and very endearing to be invited to come and volunteer, the idea that somebody would actually turn around as a movement and say, even if you're not a volunteer, even if you don't fundraise, by virtue of the fact that you have a terminal condition, you will die, you are a member. If you breathe, you're in. That's a social movement. And I think that's the kind of movement that your founder dreamed of. One of the challenges with social movements is as they grow over time, what starts to happen is they become more oriented towards being hosts of a conversation that they feel passionate about, rather than being guests in people's lives. The challenge, I think, is to balance those two out. But this idea that what we're really trying to do is to invite the community, include the community, and value the community so that they will care about our agenda, I think is worth a second thought or two, or three, or four. To really begin to debate it, to ask the question, is that really what a movement is all about? Or is it possible that the hospice movement can also be seen and known by the general public as the people who are guests in our lives, who take seriously that the wider community need to be connected into this agenda. And the best way to connect people into an agenda that you care about is to demonstrate that you care about them. The bottom line with communities, based on my experience over the years, is communities won't care about what you know until they know that you care. And so I think there's something about figuring out how, as a movement, we can come alongside people in communities who may not necessarily be ready to volunteer, fundraise, or even talk about death. They may actually want to talk about something else. But to be able to come alongside them in how they live their lives, and even if they're having different conversations to the ones we want them to have, to stay long enough until they're ready to have the ones that we know they will need sometime in their lives to have. And to kind of help us get into that a little bit, what I wanted to do is just literally, for 2 minutes, not much longer, is just invite you to turn to a neighbor and ask the question that we have here behind us. What courage is required for leaders like you to enlarge the done-by space? And I'll remind you again of the done-by space. That's the space where we see local citizens coming together with other citizens, local residents, figuring out in their own communities, what do we do about living well into death and dying well as we come to the end of life? What role do we have to play? The uncredentialed, the unqualified folk, the lay people, what can we do? Now, I know from my work around the world that actually there are lots of people in that space showing up, and I know you know them too. So I just invite you to maybe take 2 minutes to have a conversation about how you and the hospice movement could maybe do more to enlarge that space. I know you're doing lots already, but what courage is required for us to enlarge that space? So let's take a minute or two, and I'll ask for maybe 3, maybe 4 comments before we move on. So this is the kind of conversation you could spend an entire weekend on, and maybe if you find it useful, might be one to bring back to your constituents, to your colleagues. But anybody dare to share? Anybody like to have a go? And I'll just maybe take 3 comments. No, the usual rules apply, no right or wrong. Do we have microphones? I think we do. So I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to use the microphone.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Liz Hancock. I'm the Chief
Hi, Liz.
Executive of the Mary Ann Evans Hospice based in Northern Warwickshire. And one thing I've just said is that us as an organisation, and obviously I'm supposedly the leader of that, and I apologise for the quote marks, that's very immature, is that we put ourselves up on a pedestal and we do it to the community. And it's something that's just hit my mind that we're actually guilty of doing too. We occasionally do with, but we certainly don't do the last space. And that's just made me feel very guilty that we believe we're there for the community and we're not, really.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the ways of kind of holding that is to say there's certain things worth being anxious about. And I think being anxious about the extent to which we are trying to solve problems that don't totally belong to us, that's worth being anxious about. I think that's it's a mark of a professional, asking about how our power is actually affecting the agency of other people. Because I believe it's a misuse of power to solve problems that belong to other people. So it's very empowering to hear you own that and say, that's a dilemma. I don't share it to shame anybody. I share it because I think it's a dilemma we need to hold and we need to be anxious about, because that's what will make us pay attention. So thank you for paying attention, and thank you for sharing. Another back here?
Hello, my name is Avril Robinson, Chief Executive of St Clair's Hospice in Jarrow, near Newcastle, for anyone who doesn't know where Jarrow is. For me, I always like to think about things as simply as possible. So we were just chatting about storytelling. You know, everyone has a story to tell, and that really then just enables people to come alongside, to empathise, to understand. So I think many of us already in the done by category, we're doing that community outreach, standing alongside people and listening to those stories, especially then opening up conversations about death, dying and bereavement.
Beautiful, beautiful, absolutely. Stories are the great carriers of meaning, aren't they? Thank you for that. One other? Great.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Caper. I'm Head of Policy and Advocacy at Hospice UK. My neighbour and I were talking about the big challenge of overcoming risk aversion in hospice care, to allow other people to take the lead, to allow the community to take the lead in doing by for themselves. And we think that there's a big missed opportunity in hospice care to simply create platforms, to create situations for the community to do by for themselves, to make it easy for them to do that, and for hospices then to step back from controlling the outcomes or the processes of that.
Yeah, totally agree, totally agree. So it's kind of exciting, and it's also a little bit anxiety-inducing to have this conversation, but often that's what you need. You need a little grit to make change happen. So that kind of sense of being cautioned into, wow, okay, there's some challenges here, but also looking at the prospects and the possibilities. And that's a lot of the sentiment, really, at which I want to continue the presentation, because I think there is incredible opportunity, but as is always the case with opportunity, there's some real challenges too. And inevitably, I think the challenges are they're shaped within the context of the fact that many movements, by definition, as they grow, also have to grow institutional capacity. And as you grow institutional capacity, there are prices to be paid. And one of the prices is you pull more away from the by, and you're pulled into the with if you're progressive, but often you spend quite a lot of time in the to and the for. It's a very interesting exercise to do with your colleagues and with your trustees and indeed with your volunteers, and maybe even with your neighbours. Quite interesting to go out and ask your neighbours what stories are they telling about that place called the hospice. Yeah? Is it a story about a place that's a neighbour, an asset in the community, a place where if you need a meeting room, even if it has nothing to do with death, you can probably have a good chance of getting one? Or is it a fortress where people go to die? They're all stories. You're talking about stories. I think one of the great powers of stories is you can reweave them. I grew up in Ireland where the story that I was told three stories. One, you're being educated to leave. You're being educated for the boat or the plane. There's a kind of a notion you're going to the UK or you're going to America or you're going to Germany, but you're not going to get work here. You can guess my age by that, okay? The other story was that there will never be peace in Northern Ireland. It's interesting, yeah? And the third story was the story that, I think it's the story, everybody in the world loves Irish people. I discovered that isn't always true. So I think one of the things about stories is you must remember that they're also myths, that there's mixtures of truth and mythology in them. I'm a great believer in hearing people into expression and hearing their story, but also enabling people to realize that they can rewrite stories, they can recarve, they can rescript, and we can too. The notion that the hospice movement has a story and it must put its head down and continue its story, I think that's to be challenged. What excites me about social movements is they are not incarcerated by their own history. They're inspired by it, but they're inspired to move forward, not for the sake of progress, not in pursuit of glamour, but in the pursuit of authenticity. How can we authentically show up in the world as a movement? And with that question in mind, I want to share another story. And this is a story of it's the backstory, if you like, the rarely heard story of Leche League International. Now, Leche League International is the breastfeeding movement for those who are not familiar with it, and it is today one of the biggest examples of a citizen-led movement in the world. It's got a presence in 87 countries around the world, and I don't want to, in this context, get into an argument or otherwise about breastfeeding virtues of or whatever, but I just want to use it as a metaphor, as a way into, let's think a little bit, more about this thing called a movement, because we essentially use the term a lot. I think we talk about the hospice movement, right? We don't talk about the machinery of the hospice industry, right? We're using soft, feminine, community-oriented language because we're trying to communicate that the fundamental values of the hospice movement are community values. They're relational. They're about being rooted in place. They're about being rooted in person-centered conversations. They're about the good life. Now, before I tell you the story about Ann Thompson, who was the founder of Leche, I think it's really important for us to just consider that it isn't just citizens that create social movements, but it's also professionals who can create space and enable social movements. and in their own lives can create all kinds of new conversations and new stories. I was really mindful over the last couple of days, for personal reasons, of a book that you'll all be familiar with by Atul Gawande, called Being Mortal. And again, I'm a sucker for stories, and so he talks about a crossroads moment. And I think, you know, as you were sharing, a crossroads moment in a sense, you know, that moment where we're at the crossroads and we can keep going, doing what we always did, go backwards, go forward. You know, we've got options and choices. And you can feel the butterflies in your stomach, but you can also feel the excitement too. It's that kind of mixture. And for him, it came when a woman said to him, like with days to live, I'd love to bring my grandchildren to Disneyland. You remember, some of you may remember the story. And he realized at that moment, he heard her tell him what a good life would look like too late. And it woke him up to the fact that that conversation could have, should have, happened 4 months ago. And that was a crossroads moment for him. And actually, he started then paying attention to his colleagues in the palliative care world, because he started to realize, if I model as a surgeon what they do naturally and also with great skill, which is to ask a person, what would a good day look like, as opposed to the question he was asking, which is essentially, do we continue to fight or do we give up? That was the question he was asking, the binary question. And that day he realized it was the wrong question. And it's interesting how your question determines the stories you tell and the stories you hear. The stories you'll entertain and the ones that you delete. So at that moment, he opened his world up to a vista of a whole raft of new stories. And he realized that the question isn't, do we fight or do we give up? But what are we fighting for? And that lady taught him, by the people, that if he's going to be a good professional, his job is to use his expert knowing to create a dome of protection around that woman's desire to go to Disneyland with her grandchildren. That's what he was trained to do. That's the fight. And I was so excited to read that, because it's kind of uncommon narrative from the clinical world, but it gave me great hope that we're not just seeing shifts in the palliative world and in the citizen world, but we're also seeing shifts in the clinical world. And it's so nice that he referenced his colleagues in palliative care and said, they're my teachers. I'm learning from them how to show up as a human being, as a collaborator, not an expert. But boy, if anybody can teach us about showing up as a human being, it's Ann Thompson. So Marion, when in 1953 she was a young mum, decided she wanted to breastfeed her kids actually, there were two, at the time. And of course, it wasn't a popular decision, because Nestle, who were producing formula milk, had done a very, very good job of buying evidence. I'm always suspicious when people say they only do things that are evidence-based. I always want to know where the money is first. Follow the trail. Right? Evidence is interesting, but I've time and time again found when I follow the money trail, the evidence isn't as pure as it's being claimed to be. In any case, Nestle had done a really good number on people and had convinced a lot of people, including doctors and allied health professionals, that formula milk, synthetic milk, was better than breast milk. It was more fortified, and therefore, if you really cared about your baby, you would use formula milk. So anyway, Ann Thompson didn't get that memo, and she believed that as a mother, she knew what was best for her children, and so she went ahead. But she started realizing that, she needed support. And so she reached out to her doctor and realized very quickly that her doctor wasn't, for whatever reason, in a position to support her. He wasn't willing to show up. So what she did was all she could do, really. She started searching out other women, uncredentialed neighbors, effectively, who either had breastfed or were breastfeeding, and asked for help. So she had the wherewithal to do that. She found 7 other women, and very informally, with no intention of scaling up or creating, there wasn't an Excel spreadsheet in sight, right? No plan. Now, you all know that Excel spreadsheets are the vortex into which all innovation disappears. We know this. And no committees, right? We all know also that committees are the alleyway up which good ideas are lured and slowly strangled to death. So there were no committees and no Excel spreadsheets. Just people getting together and sitting down having conversations with each other. No aspiration to scale, no aspiration to growth, and didn't give an issue at all to efficiency. They were just having conversations with each other. 1953 went into 1954, and then the 60s came, and what started to happen was the opposite of scaling up. And it's technically known as proliferating. It's what happens with early social movements. Social movements don't go to scale. Scale is about standardizing things. Proliferation is about mass localism. So even though things are growing and people may say we are a group that's associated with the group that started in such and such a neighborhood in Chicago, that Marion started with 8 of her neighbors, they will look differently everywhere you go, like mushrooms popping up. And that's what happens. So by the 50s, these informal groups were popping up all over the US. Groups of women who were meeting, creating mutuality, and supporting each other around breastfeeding. By the 80s, there were hundreds of thousands of these groups informally meeting. Very little structure, excepting that they decided they should call themselves something and they should try and meet once a year. And it was interesting at the time, the very early 60s, when they came up with a name. This was very, very early 60s. By mid-60s, it wasn't an issue, but sort of late 59, 60, 61, it was an issue to talk about breastfeeding publicly. So they had to come up with a code. And what happened was one of their members was coming out of a church in Florida and noticed that the statue of the Madonna was just outside her church, and it was breastfeeding the Christ child. And the statue was called Madonna della Leche. So they call themselves La Leche League International. Madonna della Leche is mother of the milk. That's what it means. So they had a kind of a code, and essentially it just grew. What's interesting is this. By 1983, the very community of professionals who were telling Ann Thompson and others like her, don't breastfeed, use formula milk, had now reversed their view. And they were saying, no, absolutely, breast milk is best. But what's also very interesting is what they started to do was deploy professionals to go and be in those breastfeeding groups, because God only knows what a group of mothers might actually say to each other. And by then, you see, this is the really interesting thing, by then, because all of the professionals agreed that breastfeeding was a good thing, what they started doing was trying to be helpful. So they would go to these breastfeeding groups and they would give expert advice. And what Marion said started to happen was the women who were coming, not for expert advice, but for mutuality and for the experience that one has when one lives and does and breathes and practices breastfeeding, and a million other things that they did. They didn't just talk about breastfeeding. That's what people were coming for. And when the experts came into the conversation, they left. And so by about 83, 84, the membership was dying. It was in serious jeopardy as a movement. So what I'm describing to you there, technically, is colonization. It's the institutional world moving in and trying to eclipse the civic world. So I met Marion when she was 83 years young. So she had 65 years of experience of being at the forefront. Forefront's the wrong word, but being at the center, maybe, of a social movement. And I was interviewing her for my book, and I said, look, I work a lot with social movements. You know, looking back over the last 65 years, what can you share based on your experience with other social movements? And I'm particularly interested to know, how can social movements stop being, appropriated by the system? Stop being turned into the very thing that their founders didn't want them to be? How can they make sure that they're not pulled away from the community world and pulled into the clinical world? And she said, I'll give you 3 pieces of advice for what they're worth. And she said, I don't know that they're transferable to every social movement, but certainly they were significant in ours and lots of others. She said the first thing we learned about being a social movement, and we learned this looking backwards rather than planning forwards, was that if you're serious about being a social movement in community space, you've got to keep everything mother-sized. I said, what do you mean by that? She said, well,
we were a mother-led movement. And if we started getting too big, if we started getting obsessed about scale, we'd essentially start focusing on issues of institution rather than relationship. We had to organize ourselves. If we were going to be a movement that was still led by mothers, we had to organize ourselves in such a way that we were in pram-pushing distance of every gathering so that mums could get to us. And I kind of thought you could take that narrative and you could really generalize around it. So making sure that everything you do is in Zimmer frame pushing distance. You know, getting as close to people's doorsteps as possible. I said, you know, well, why was that a good thing to do? I kind of knew, but I was interviewing her, and she said, you know, it's really interesting now. We're in 87 countries around the world, but everything has remained hyper-local. She said, when you are really trying to grow a social movement, your measure is not how much money you're getting from the state to do a program. Your measure is how many lay people show up and feel that they're a member. You know, you can define that in two ways. She's a really, really interesting lady. She said, you know, remembering, she said, can be understood in two ways. One is recall, the other is reconnection. She said, more than any time in the history of social movements, we need to remember at both levels. And the recall must be, you've got to keep it small, you've got to keep it local. So I think for the hospice movements, small needs to become the new big. And really pushing against funders and commissioners who insist on scalability, who insist on bigness, because they've got a big thing about that, I think. And I think we have to disabuse them. Maybe that's one of the things that collective bargaining can allow, but it's something to really push against. The second thing she said is you've got to be clear about what you're for, not what you're against. So what is the hospice movement for? Well, we've already been reminded what your founder believes it's for. And I think that people in this room totally live and embody that. It's not just words, it's rooted in day-to-day practice. But as we heard earlier on, there's always space to invite more people in. So I think being clear about what you're for, what she meant by that, what Marion meant by that was they could have gone down the road of protesting against the formal industry, and they could have gone down the road of challenging the misogyny of male doctors, which were largely what was available to women at that time. But they didn't. They chose instead to be clear about their own mission. They chose to invite people into being clear about breastfeeding, but not just breastfeeding, family and community as well. And accordingly, they grew a movement that's in 80, 87, 88 countries around the world now. The final thing she shared with me, and this just blew my mind, she had told me about what was happening in the mid-80s and professionals coming in and colonizing. She said, if you're a social movement and you want to stay really rooted with grassroots, you want your membership to be lay people, then it's absolutely critical, she said, that you find yourself a border hound. I said, a border hound? What's a border hound? And she said, well, that's somebody who's really respected by the clinical world, the medical world, the health world, but also believes in the civic world. That's somebody who'll stand in the middle and mind the gap between the two worlds and is prepared to say, these women are health producers. They're not just consumers of your service. What they do when they get together is as valid a way of producing health as what you do in your surgery or in your hospital. It's different. It certainly isn't done through expertise, but it nevertheless is legitimate health production. It is a health creation that you don't recognize. You should, but you don't. You need to find one of those, she said. Somebody who actually takes the Hippocratic Oath seriously and believed that when they signed up to it, that it wasn't just to do no harm to individuals, but also to do no harm to communities. And they found that in this chap here, Robert Mendelsohn. Robert's a bit of a medical heretic. In fact, he wrote a book called Medical Heretic and also wrote other books like How to Keep Your Child Well in Spite of Your Doctor. So he was an interesting character who was speaking out against the health profession and actually reminding the health profession at the time, in the 50s and 60s, that the reason women were dying of cancer 7 times more than men was because women were actually x-rayed 7 times more by their doctors than men at the time. And unfortunately, many of those x-rays were actually exposing women to incredible danger. And so he was one of the first to actually come out and whistleblow. You know, a great model of what whistleblowing is all about. Or I would say being an ethical practitioner. So in a sense, I often use the football metaphor, the American football metaphor of the linebacker to describe him. I think ethical practitioners are like linebackers. And in American football, the linebacker basically stops the opposing team wrestling or whatever they do, tackling the guy who's running with the ball, who's going to get the touchdown. Now, in my mind, in that metaphor, the community are the heroes. I think that the community can do things around helping us to make meaning of death that cannot be done by and through palliative care, and cannot be done in the clinical world. And somehow I think what we're learning from the likes of Ann Thompson is there are 3 ways of addressing end of life. And hopefully I can get to these really quickly. The first is to ask the question, what is it that the communities that live around us, that maybe aren't even talking about death right now, what is it that they can do that cannot be done through palliative care and cannot be done through clinical intervention? What are the irreplaceable functions of community? And in a few moments, I'm going to argue there's lots. The second question is, what is it that communities and families can do, but with the help of the palliative world? And I'm using palliative very loosely. I'm sorry to do that, but I'm trying to define something, and I have limited time. And indeed, the clinical world. What help do they require, where they're primarily in the lead? And finally, what do they need done for them? Now, the reason that I think we fall into the to and for trap we were talking about earlier on is we don't ask those first 2 questions. We, I believe, are nearly always in a situation where we're in delivery mode. So we're providing a service or providing a support or providing some kind of, intervention, I guess, at times. And for that reason, I would suggest that we're in the third question domain. And we really, if we can get to it, we'll often try and get to the first and second question. But by the time we get to it, the first question has really begun to dominate the conversation. Now, the beauty is that you guys and the hospice movement, I believe, have carved out a new space, which wasn't there previously, to be able to have the good life conversation. But I honestly believe the good life conversation is not enough. It's not enough to know what somebody's good life is like, unless we know how to then build a bridge between that good life and the interdependent experience and community that they're looking for. If we have no relationships there, if we have no membership there, if we have no knowledge there, then it's a non-known land. And so we can't broker. So what we end up doing often is we'll make referrals, or we'll do the best we can do. But imagine if we were in a situation where, as well as being person-centered, we were also community-centered. And if we weren't the ones doing all the work, if we were actually in a position where communities understood that they have work to do, that there are actually community functions when it comes to dying. There are certain things that only communities can do. And that brings me back. Chairman, Chair Lady, how are we doing time-wise?
We are out of time.
We need to stop, do we? Can I just finish then by just, yeah, thank you.
I could listen
I know when to defer. These 2 guys, I think, have given us, I'm going to kind of just wrap it up, but I think these 2 guys have given us a real insight into what exists in community space and why I think the hospice movement should excitedly really think about being more active and more engaged in that space. What they've said, and we continue, I'm part of the faculty, we've continued to see in 35 countries over 21 years around the world, is that there are 6 building blocks to living well into death and indeed living peacefully as you die. These building blocks are so, I think, almost normal and natural that we casually forget them. We don't see them as having the value that they have. But it's the skills of local neighbours. I've seen it over the last few days in my own family. It's associational life. It's the clubs and the groups like the Leche League International that exist in every neighbourhood. It's the institutions that are prepared to organize themselves the way people organize their lives instead of expecting people to organize their lives the way they're organized. So the institutions that get that they exist to use their assets to build community, not to recruit people to be clients of their services, right? And not build silos. Silos are where smart people go to do dumb things. But the institutions that understand that smart people go to actually bring life together, and community is the space where you get out of your silo and join things up. But also economic opportunities and environment and the place itself. What we have found time and time again is at the end of life, when people are talking about what a good day looks like, they are talking about these things. And the challenge that faces us, whatever movement we are, whether we're interested in breastfeeding or we're interested in end of life, or wherever it is we're coming from, whatever your question, community is an essential part of the answer. There just simply is no replacement. And so the challenge, perhaps I'll conclude with this before I get in trouble, the challenge, I think, is to discover, connect, and mobilize the assets that you see behind me here. If we can find a way, we don't have to do it all because there are allies that are prepared to help us, but if we could find a way to come alongside communities and help them to discover what it is that they can do to really show up in a competent way around the good life conversation, I think what we'll begin to discover is there is an untapped reservoir of possibility just waiting for us. And that it behoves, but it also, I think, invites a movement like yours in. 3 last thoughts. To do this, I think we need to be very thoughtful about shifting the story away from the story that, you know, when you've got sickness or you've got somebody in your family who's at end of life, you exile them or you send them or you refer them to the experts in palliative care and they sort the problem out. To, we are collaborators. We come alongside families and communities, not as experts, though we have expert knowledge, but as co-conspirers for a peaceful death and a full life. We are the co-conspirers. I love the way somebody else spoke and said, I think you were being playful, you know, saying in inverted commas, and you were being playful. That we will playfully come alongside you, not as the ones that know, but as the ones that are prepared to walk with you and collaborate. And that means we won't steal from you problems that are yours, because we know that's a misuse of power. So that's the first shift. The second is to shift from thinking about the movement as delivering services solely, to thinking about the movement as delivering necessary services, but also as being a movement that's about animating and activating and enabling people to discover what it is they themselves can do in family and in community life. So how do we shift from deliverables to discoverables? And finally, I think to do that, we've got to be radically prepared to go back to the founder's vision and believe that everybody has the capacity to live a good life, and that death isn't a problem to be fixed, but it is part of the human experience to be embraced. Embracing it means that we've got to lift labels off and not be trapped by old stories, but instead reweave new ones that allow us to see that we must start with what's strong and use what's strong to address the challenges we face. And if we do that, I think we'll be living up and fulfilling the very foundational principles of the hospice movement. And I believe actually today, the people that sit in front of me are doing just that. But there's more work to be done. So onwards, and thank you.